Good afternoon, mentees. I'm really excited to be hosting this first program of the mentorship program of AAMC. And I'm Christina Chang. I'm a member of the Career Support Committee, and I was really excited when collaboration came up as a possible topic, because these days, collaboration is definitely the norm. Inside institutions, curators are expected to know automatically how to be good team players and work well with other members of not only the curatorial department, but also across the museum. Although rarely, if ever, is kind of interpersonal relationship building part of curatorial training. It's just expected of you. And also institutions are seeing value in collaborating with one another. So as point of example, Pacific Standard Time in Southern California is billing itself as an unprecedented collaboration across institutions. In the Midwest, which is where I'm based, in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, Front International Triennial for Contemporary Art is a new triennial that's based in and around Cleveland, and again is looking at, quote, artistic collaborations. And so I think it's really valuable as kind of young curators coming up in the field to really get a handle on what exactly it means to collaborate and what that all entails. And as a reminder, this webinar is meant to be more of a conversation format rather than a formal presentation. So the presenters and I will speak for about 45 minutes after I've introduced them, and feel free to send in your questions as they come to you through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, which, depending on where you've oriented it, it's on my right, and you'll see that there are different menu options, and if you click the arrow for questions, then you can type in your question and I'll be able to field them and then ask them to our presenters. And I would also remind you that we really want this conversation to be frank and open, and so the questions will remain anonymous. And so feel free to get as personal as you wish, and know that this is a supportive venue for asking really honest questions that you may have about teamwork and what it's like to work with colleagues. So the other part of the webinar also focuses on how to build kind of a supportive institutional culture, what role you can play. And I think this idea of open communication and generous spirit is really important in terms of understanding that it's about kind of how you present to the partners you're collaborating with as well. And so today we'll be hearing from Nancy Barr, who is co-chief curator and department head of prints, drawings, and photography at the Detroit Institute of Art, and Alexandra Schwartz, formerly curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and Montclair Art Museum, and who is now independent. So I've asked them to discuss the rewards and challenges of collaborating, where they've had to adapt, what lessons they learned, and maybe even how they do it differently the next time. So to jump right into the conversation, Nancy, I was really impressed learning about how deeply integrated collaboration is within the DIA's institutional culture, and how exhibition development is not only the purview of the curatorial department, but really crosses several departments. And so if you could share with the mentees a little bit of background about how kind of collaboration became this, mode of operation for the institution.
Sure. Yes. Hello and welcome, everyone. I have been here at the museum for over 20 years, and when I came here in the 1990s, we were in the middle of starting up a reinstallation plan museum-wide. So we eventually, we had a new director at the time, Graham Beal, who's now retired, and Graham really wanted to think out of the box about how to reinstall the permanent collections. And we are a museum of all, from ancient to contemporary times, a comprehensive museum. We had to reinstall 400,000 square feet of galleries. How are we going to do this? How are we going to respond to visitors in a new and fresh and contemporary way? So the feeling was really to work in teams that could review the collections and figure out things that would be interesting for visitors in different ways. So we initiated a whole department of interpretation here in our education department, and they really kind of took the lead on how to develop big ideas around collections, and everybody worked in teams. There were even marketing people on teams. So it was a cross section of museum staff people on these teams. And we launched, a brand new museum in 2007. So, but the process of getting to collaboration was difficult for a lot of people. I think a lot of curators tend to are maybe be introverted, a little bit more introverted than other people, or are introvert leaning, and they need to have a little help learning how to work in groups. At least back in the 90s, it was more so. I think now people are a little bit more used to working in groups and collaborative processes. So it was tough, and we brought in coaches to help us through that process and to teach us how to work in groups and how to recognize sort of signals when things are getting in trouble, when people are disagreeing, how to kind of navigate those situations, because everybody has big opinions in museums and there's lots of noise, as somebody recently said to me. So that's pretty much where the DIA got started, and we have not left that model. That model is continuing to be a work in process, how we work with how curators and educators, their relationships, curators in response to marketing individuals who do social media. Social media has really changed a lot here at the museum and the way we think about visitors. So we even co-create exhibitions with community groups, and we have community groups come in and work with us. We're in the middle of reinstalling our Asian galleries right now, and we've had some great success working with bigger teams that include people from the community. So that's kind of where we're at, Christina. I don't know if there's any other questions or anything else you'd like me to review there.
Well, you had mentioned that coaches have been brought in, and so specialists in the working of teams and the team dynamics, and the mentees had received a slide you had especially important. And so I'll just say a few words.
If you have that in front of you, there one in particular was the Tuckman model that was developed in 1965 about team effectiveness. And teams go through cycles when people get together. And basically the cycle is forming, storming, norming, performing. And I think you can read the different descriptions of the different phases of a team. So to have a highly effective team, I think you have to recognize that there's places where people are just inquiring with each other. It's great to start out with inquiry and find out what's in people's heads, what they're thinking, what their point of view is. There's definitely going to be a point where people are fighting a little bit and trying to get their positions out on the table. And then there's a point where everybody kind of relaxes and you start performing a little bit better together. You get to know each other, you understand the perspectives. It's really great that we work with these big ideas, so everybody kind of gets aligned under a big idea around a permanent collection gallery or otherwise. And then you work your way well into performing as a group, and it takes some time. But I think if you recognize that this is normal, and all groups and teams go through this process of norming, storming, performing, forming, storming, norming, performing, it really helps you get through the process and understand that you're not alone, that this is sort of the way groups function. And I think I also distributed the 7 norms for collaboration, which we actually have up in a lot of our project rooms. And if you might want to review that a little bit on your own, but just learning how to listen has been a really important skill that I've had to develop over the years. It's something you have to think about sometimes when you're used to talking and, you know, kind of being the center of the expert, right? You're used to talking and having the table. So you have to listen to what other people have to say. So, I would definitely, if you have time to review this, if you're going into situations where you're working on teams, the 7 norms of collaboration and the team effectiveness, the Tuckman model, really have kind of helped us all understand how to behave and how the teams work together.
Thanks, Nancy. I think your kind of emphasis on norms is really helpful, because I think when you're first trying something new and you're finding it difficult, it seems like you're doing something wrong. But if you can keep in mind that everyone is feeling this way when they're going through the process for the first time, then, you know, it's helpful to kind of cut people a little slack and be more generous in terms of how you're responding to, you know, dynamics within the group. And Alex, you've also worked at large institutions. And so I don't know if anything stood out for you while Nancy was talking in terms of the difference of culture at the institutions you were working at. Sounds like at the DIA, they really invested in that way of working as an institutional model. And I know that you had mentioned that at the Museum of Modern Art, you were involved in a really huge project that had a lot of players and was interdisciplinary to boot. So if you wanted to say a few words about collaboration there.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. I was thinking about the topic of collaboration, and during the course of my career, I've encountered it in a lot of different ways. And I guess I think of curatorial work as being inherently collaborative. Much more, can you hear me okay?
To be honest, I have 2 accounts with you. One, we're...
You guys hear some other coming in here?
Talking about accounts.
Yeah. Does anyone know what that is?
Looks like it stopped.
Okay.
Maybe someone had their audio on by accident.
Okay. So the project that you were referring to, Christina, was at MoMA. It's one that I worked on, it was about 10 years ago, and it was called the Modern Women's Project. And it was one of the first interdisciplinary, interdepartmental projects MoMA had done. And until that time, MoMA was very kind of divided by department. So painting and sculpture, drawings, prints, etc. And there really wasn't a lot of that kind of collaboration. There's a lot more now. But the way it worked was, it was an initiative to do more research on work by women artists in the museum. There was a special grant that funded it. And it worked with an interdepartmental committee. So the chair of it was my boss, and I was kind of, at the time, a sort of coordinator for all of it. And there was at least one representative from each of the then, I believe, 7 curatorial departments. And it was an interesting one because it had a real mission. I think everyone involved in it was very eager to do work on women artists. It ended up being a very large book on the permanent collection, work by women in the permanent collection, and a series of permanent collection shows. But it had this kind of activist quality to it because people really felt it was important to bring a feminist perspective to the museum and to highlight the work of these artists. So our little committee was remarkably harmonious, I would say, although excuse me, although there was a lot of just negotiating all the way through how the project was going to be structured, what kind of information we needed to get it going, where the research should go, what the structure of the book should be, what the show should be. And it ended up being kind of the committee as a united whole, explaining the project a lot to other players at the museum who had not worked that way previously. I think because we all were on this kind of mission, we worked very well as a group, but there was a lot of kind of, you know, saying what the project was about and organizing people's ideas, organizing the research with the rest of the museum. But I think that it, you know, it definitely logistically was very complicated. Communication was always very, very important. We had, I think, 40 authors for the book, many different people doing shows. So there was just a lot of constantly kind of communicating with people about what they wanted to do, what they felt was important, how they were doing in their project, meeting deadlines, that kind of thing. So it was a very collaborative project, but at the same time, there was room for people to kind of pursue their own interests. But it was just a matter of kind of constantly coordinating with people about what they were doing, what they wanted to do, how they were doing with their work. And I think that's one of the most important parts of collaboration, especially on a creative project like this, to just always be checking in a collegial way that everyone is kind of on the same page, working toward the same mission, the same kind of ideas and standards about what the end product will be, and just a very, very good eye for kind of both the big picture and coordinating all the various logistics.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciated your point about how it felt easier to be on the team when you had the shared mission or a shared investment in the project. And so maybe that's something to keep in mind as we're moving forward with future collaborations, how to kind of shape the form of this collaboration in a way that really speaks to everyone so that everyone is invested at the same level as everyone else.
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, after being at MoMA as a first job, I founded a contemporary art program at a much smaller museum, the Montclair Art Museum, and was in the position for the first time in my life of having to organize a team, be the leader. As I said, it was a new program, so I had to kind of convert people to the importance of the new program and how there were certain, you know, things that kind of had to be done in a different way than often other people in other departments were used to. And I think curators are often in that position of having to kind of dive in and learn management when we haven't been trained for it in graduate school. If you're a junior curator moving into a senior position, as I was, I really didn't have the experience doing that. And you know, that's a position where the curator is kind of in a leadership role, but it has to be collaborative or it's just not going to work. You have to kind of know what other people's jobs are, respect that they're doing their jobs well, listen to people when they're telling you the best way to do things in their opinion, and really have kind of an exchange and a back and forth and get people excited and passionate about what you're trying to accomplish.
And Nancy, I saw you nodding your head at certain points.
Great. Yeah, you know, I'm glad that you brought up the fact that we're not trained in managerial roles as curators, and the training's not really changing for curators. So you kind of have to. We were fortunate here to have worked with some coaches and to have a strong ODHR department that you can kind of lean on and say, well, I need a little help here, and how can I manage this situation, and you know, how can we work better? How can we work as a more productive team? And so we kind of had that here to guide us, but it's hard getting thrown into that.
Very. and we're not well trained to do it at all.
No.
And I think one sort of distinction that I personally have always had have always found challenging is the difference between confrontation and conflict. This idea that if you're going, if you disagree, it's automatically a negative thing, and it somehow immediately shifts into combative mode, which means, you know, someone's on the offensive and someone's on the defensive. But of course, people disagree all the time, and it doesn't necessarily have to have kind of a negative emotion behind it.
True.
So, you know, I'm glad you said that there is this process of kind of getting to know one another. And I think maybe, do you have any suggestions for kind of how to create and develop and foster that sort of relationship? Like, are there sort of extra project related activities or communications that maybe help sort of forge a relationship? And maybe Alex, you can speak to how you do that as an independent curator when you're kind of not necessarily off on site and interacting with individuals kind of on a more informal basis. How do you develop that rapport?
Well, being an independent curator is a kind of interesting proposition, because on the one hand, I would say it's not as collaborative because you're not part of a staff. There's not a kind of internal structure that you have to deal with so much. Excuse me. And, you know, at least in the cases where I've been working, I've been kind of bringing the intellectual and curatorial vision to the project, and then working with the registrars and development and marketing and what have you, according to their rules to make it happen. So the last project I did was an exhibition with the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts, and I live in New York, so I would kind of go there every 6 weeks or so for a bunch of meetings. And I found, I mean, it's a very well-run institution. They're used to having outside curators. So it all worked very smoothly kind of from an internal side. But I found the best way in most situations to come into it is just try to get to know people as people, you know, like, I think meeting people over lunch is really important, finding out a little bit about them, what their experiences have been, what their background is, just, you know, who they are. And if you can kind of develop that friendly rapport with people, I think that's a great basis for learning how to work together. And especially as an outside curator, I am always very mindful to be respectful of how an institution does things, and to try to work with that as much as I can, and to be a team player for a short period of time. But I think that just kind of being friendly and level-headed and reasonable, and, you know, even when you encounter problems, not to get your back up, I think that's always the best way to kind of approach these things. And often it'll just sort of fall into place if you're listening to what people want and need, and you can express what you want and need. It's sort of the best way to negotiate those things.
And thanks, Alex. And Nancy, I know that there was a citywide kind of collaboration recently around the Detroit riots, which the DIA was involved in, and also different institutions were involved in. And so if you could talk a little bit about how that went, and if what Alex is talking about in terms of, you know, that first sort of establishing relationships and getting to know one another, if that happened, etc.
Yes, we we did participate in a citywide exhibitions and programs surrounding the anniversary of the 50th anniversary year of the 1967 rebellion. And it was interesting because as this was happening, we had a change in leadership here. We got a new director, Salvador Solar Pons. And we had talked before he came on board about trying to get involved in work with some other institutions, and it just wasn't happening. But if you read your art news headlines, you know the different crises that the DI has been through over the past few years. So with bankruptcy and millage proposals and cultural taxes, and so then we got a new director, and he really he's a very open person. Not that Graham wasn't open, but Salvador is just he's younger, he's very open, he's very interested in partnerships and collaboration with a number of our local institutions, and he just jumped right in and got us involved in a way that we hadn't been involved. But we have to tread lightly as being like the big institution in town. There's lots of other smaller institutions. There's the Detroit Historical Society. There's the Charles Wright Museum for African American Art. There's MOCAD, Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit, and a number of other places. There's archives, and there's a university nearby. So we were careful not to try to lead everything and try to work very collaboratively. And I thought we did a great job getting involved, and it helped us get to know new partners on a whole different level. So, and rather than going in and telling everybody what to do, we truly did partner in a way that I don't think we'd ever done before. So it was a nice break, and we got a lot of great press about our show and the other projects that were going on in town. So it was a great learning experience for us, and we have some really great partners here in Detroit. So it was great to get out there and meet new people and just come to the table. But the communication part of it, which Alex brought up, is so important. Trying to keep all those different parties in loop and feeling engaged, and it just takes a lot. It takes a lot more work than working all by yourself, right? So you have to get to that point where you need to make the investment, that you're going to be maybe putting in a few hours after work, making some phone calls, having drinks with people, having lunch, having a casual meeting over coffee. I mean, you have to spend a lot more time. Collaboration means you're spending a lot more time doing things, and you just have to give into it at some point.
And as far as either of you can chime in here, I think you mentioned partnership, which has kind of a different valence than collaboration. Collaboration seems to apply to a specific project, and once the project is over, then everyone sort of disbands and goes on their own separate ways. But as far as partnerships, which is another sort of purview that's being added to curators, have any collaborations yielded longer term sort of productive relationships for either of you?
I have to think about that.
I mean, I could only think of like the foundations. So Detroit, had a big renaissance a few years ago, and the Knight Foundation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Christina, because they do a lot of work in Minnesota, and the Ford Foundation and the Kresge Foundation. All this new leadership popped up, and the partnerships kind of started coming into play a lot differently for us here at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And those have been lasting relationships, and those are relationships we have to negotiate and work out. So in regard to foundations, I think there's always partnerships. In regard to smaller organizations, we're trying harder to formalize a partnership, like, for example, with the Charles Wright Museum of African American Art. We really would like to make that a little more formal of a partnership somehow. We're working through that. It's all partnerships are kind of a work in progress for us here in Detroit and maybe elsewhere.
I would say that I've done fewer of the institutional partnerships, and right now I'm not with an institution. But one thing that we haven't really brought up that I think is really important to a lot of curators, and I noticed that a lot of people in the mentorship program do contemporary, and that's partnership with artists and with galleries and also foundations that support contemporary art. As a contemporary curator, you are constantly partnering with artists, whether it's a solo show and it's a real partnership or collaboration between you and the kind of curatorial vision you have and what the artist wants to convey and how they want their work shown. You're also working with their galleries and with collectors, with foundations who are supporting you. And those are certainly long-term partnerships, and often people will work with artists or galleries at many different times over the course of a curatorial career, and those really have to be collaborations. I mean, a living artist or even an artist's estate or foundation has often its own interest and agenda, and it's a very kind of important balancing act and sort of diplomatic mission to work with a lot of artists and estates and galleries to make sure that both your vision is coming through and also that the artist or their representatives are happy with what you're doing.
I'm glad you mentioned collaborating with artists and the important place of diplomacy in kind of negotiating some of their demands versus what is realistically possible. And so kind of transitioning more into kind of question and answer versus the, we've laid out some of your specific case studies. I think you'll find that collaboration is often kind of shorthand for innovative, or that it's somehow exciting. If a program is collaborative, if a project is collaborative, then it automatically takes on, a certain, I guess, added value. And so there will be instances in when collaboration is sort of thrown out there as more of, say, kind of a teaser or a draw without necessarily kind of the great intent that we've been discussing thus far, where, just to be kind of really, frank about it, well, what if a collaboration doesn't really feel like a collaboration? It feels more like someone else is taking credit for your works. How do, especially young curators who feel like they have to kind of, toe the line and, be respectful of the chain of command and hierarchies. Any sort of thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. A lot.
Yeah.
Nancy, you want to go first?
I'll try. I think that one of the challenges of working collaboratively is reminding the curators that they need to always, part of the norms of collaboration are promoting a spirit of inquiry. So, I mean, you cannot lay down to somebody else's vision. If it's truly a collaboration, because that's just not a collaboration. And, curators do have a reputation for being experts, and, and things are changing out in our visitor-centered world that is at the DIA. But I do think that it's a constant thing to kind of push curators to say, keep working at it. You shouldn't just completely abandon your own vision or whatever you feel strongly about because somebody else is pushing an agenda or a particular point. And it's important to remember that, because you don't want to look like the bad guy. If you're, like you said, Christina, it's not always bad to disagree or to challenge people. It shouldn't always be viewed as negative. So I think you have to be very brave sometimes.
I would agree with that. And I guess I have two thoughts about this. One is I feel as if, at least in a curatorial context, the word collaborative tends to come out in job descriptions and things like that because, and I'm going to be frank here, curators often have a bad reputation within museums for being dictatorial or being divas and having a particular vision and just wanting everyone to conform to it. And, you know, honestly, I think there's some truth to that. Like if you are the one initiating a program, you do want it to kind of materialize according to your vision. And that's why curators are hired. That's why we go to so much school. And, you know, we're the creatives in the team. And I think that's fine. But I think that being collaborative can be kind of a code in those instances for not being a jerk, basically, and for listening to other people, for not being a prima donna, for kind of working in a collaborative or a collegial way with your colleagues. And I think that's something that happens in a lot of institutions. I think the DIA sounds like it's maybe kind of an exception there, and you know, departments tend to have a kind of more equal footing than in some. But that's one thought on it. The other thought is, as I mentioned, I started off at MoMA as a junior curator, and MoMA is probably the most hierarchical museum there is out there. It's just incredibly rigid in its structure. And if you're a junior person, it's kind of understood that you're lucky to be there and you're not going to get promoted, and you know, you kind of get the experience you can while you're there, and it's a privilege to be learning where you are. And a lot of that is true. You know, I will say, I think that my training, it was just invaluable. But you do end up doing a lot of work for senior curators and not getting the credit. And I think that that's changing. Like, you often see credit lines that it's a senior curator and a junior curator, and a curatorial assistant with a curatorial assistant, which is great. But also, I think there are ways sometimes to try to work within that, especially if you have a good boss. If you don't have a good boss, you know, it can be harder. But when I was a curatorial assistant at MoMA, I actually was able to get a co-editor credit on the Modern Women book. I got to do a couple of my own shows, which was unusual. And it was partly because I had a really good boss who was interested in working collaboratively and in giving credit where credit was due. She's known as kind of a feminist thinker, which I think really helped. She believed in younger people kind of getting their due and in mentoring them. And I'm very, very grateful for that. But you have to ask, you know, you're not going to get anything if you don't ask. Right. And if it's not being offered to you, a credit on a show or the opportunity to write a catalog essay, you should ask. And the worst thing that'll happen is that they say no. But you're a professional, you may be young, but you have a right to try to get more opportunities. And I think, you know, you have to be sure not to be defensive about it, and, you know, but I think that if you have a good, trustful working relationship, they'll listen to you and take you seriously, and you might be able to get to do more than you thought you would.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of people don't ask, and I think it's really important to the mentees out there that you remember to always think about your professional track in your jobs. And yeah, like I said, be brave and ask, and, you know, just practice by yourself asking, do whatever you have to do, but don't be afraid to get in there and try to get some attention for yourself.
And to be honest, I think often senior curators in big institutions like that may not even consciously be not giving you opportunities. They just have so much else going on that they kind of forget. Right. And they're very grateful to you for, you know, doing so much work. But it doesn't hurt to kind of politely remind them and, you know, ask for some credit.
Right. Yeah.
And so again, kind of looping back to the point of generosity, just giving individuals the benefit of the doubt that there isn't really a malicious intent. Maybe that, you know, I would also encourage mentees to take advantage of this great opportunity you have working with mentors who have a personal investment in, you know, helping you move forward in the career. You know, tips if something were to come up, you know, kind of running it by your mentors and saying, okay, well, this is how I thought about approaching this issue. Do you think this is totally off base? Am I using the right words? Am I framing it the right way? So I think mentees are really you are in a really great position to kind of take this advice from Alex and Nancy about, you know, being brave and putting yourself out there, and asking for credit where credit is due in collaborations that are maybe more one-sided than others. And I do have a question that came in. This one is for Nancy, and the mentee asked if you could describe a bit more about the differences that the partnerships took on with the foundations, and I'm guessing versus you know, other types of partnerships, and especially since there's kind of maybe a financial sort of consequence to the relationship. Yeah,
it's all about money, but I will say that it was really interesting to be here, because I'm a native Detroiter, and it was interesting to see this cycle of Detroit kind of coming back, and everybody taking interest, getting a lot of national attention. So when we started to work with the foundations more, when the foundations started to come to us, and there was always foundations interested in our work, but I think, you know, the whole contemporary art scene here and getting Detroit as a creative city was really at the forefront of a lot of people thinking about how the foundations could help and set up grants and set up fellowships and things like that, and just kind of help the museum become a better place to help foster that creativity in the community, and knowing too that museums also help foster economic growth in communities. So I think it was just sort of timing for us with the different foundations. Detroit finally got on their radar, and you know, the Knight Foundation brought an office here, which was kind of unusual because again, they're based in Minnesota. So it just, like, all the planets kind of aligned for us, and you know, we really had to recognize what some of our faults were as a big institution that largely had a little bit of, not a little bit, but it had a very big elitist kind of reputation in town, and we are still working on that. I mean, a lot of people, we're off-putting to a lot of people who live here. They just think they don't belong here at the DIA. So it's an uphill battle, but we have these partners now who can help us, and who help us with programs and help us with things out in the community. So there's an increasing awareness of community and getting the museum out into the community that I think is important. But I keep saying work in progress because it's developing all the time.
Thanks, Nancy. And this next question is for you, Alex. As an independent curator, how do you initiate collaborative projects or partnerships? So how are these projects started? Do you have prior relationships that you are then kind of falling back on, etc.?
Good question. I haven't been an independent curator for that long, just over a year. And for me, it's a way to have time at home with my soon-to-be kids, one kid and another kid coming.
Congratulations.
Yeah. But I so far have been very lucky in that the projects have kind of come to me. The first project I did, well, they've come to me, but they've all been through contacts. People who I've known from different parts of my life. Actually, the project, The Clark, sort of came to me because of AAMC, and someone I had worked with on a committee is a curator at the Clark and knew me, and that's kind of how it happened. But the first project I did was a small show in London, and a colleague who I had known at MoMA and who's now at the Drawing Center recommended me for this. And it kind of happened that way. And then the Clark was a show on Helen Frankenthaler, who I've always been interested in. And I had met with the head of the Frankenthaler Foundation just to introduce myself and tell her that I was interested in doing research. And then she recommended me to a curator at the Clark who I knew through AAMC. So networking has been incredibly important in making these projects happen. Some are people who I've worked with, some are people who I've reached out to, like the head of the Frankenthaler Foundation. And that's kind of how the projects have come about. And then I'm working on a new show that it's kind of been brewing for me for several years. And that one I'm actually trying to initiate on my own. And I've been talking to different colleagues about it. I'm not in the phase where I'm kind of doing hard pitches for the show, but I've been talking to colleagues, friends about the idea. And I applied for a grant from Étant Donné, which is part of the FACE Foundation, the French American Cultural Exchange, to do research in Paris for the show, and I got it. So I get to go to France, which is great. But I think that reaching out for that kind of opportunity hopefully will be helpful in getting the show off the ground. And as in any kind of exhibition, once you have institutional support behind it, like the Étant Donné grant, it kind of gives you some traction. But when I am at the point where I'm actually trying to get the show into a museum, I'm going to be having a lot of lunches with friends in museums, contacting people who I've worked with in the past, who I know take traveling shows, that kind of thing. Incidentally, that is not very different from traveling a show from an institution. When I was at Montclair, I had an exhibition that had a tour with 3 other venues, and it was just the same process, like getting to know people through colleagues of colleagues, going to conferences and meeting people, getting the word out there about the show, and then just writing a lot of emails asking about whether people would be interested. And sometimes they come to you, but I'd say it's a combination, but it all comes down to networking and getting the word out there, getting your idea out there, and seeing where it can go.
Thanks, Alex. And Nancy, while we wait maybe for a couple more questions to come in, do you have any insights to add about kind of initiating a partnership? So we've been talking thus far about having collaborations kind of already in existence and how you're working within them. So how has it been for you to maybe be the initiator of a collaboration?
Oh, that's a great question, because I'm by trade a photography curator, and I've done a couple of exhibitions here with local artists. And one recently was called the Walk-in Portrait Studio, and we had to go out and we really wanted to work with some of the up and coming, like the grassroots organizations in Detroit. Detroit's this very DIY, do-it-yourself kind of community where people they don't like the school system, they go buy a building and they start a new school, or they start a recycling company, or there's just been a lot of really great DIY here in Detroit. And this photographer I was working with knew a lot of these people and really wanted to sort of document this particular time in Detroit history, because we're gentrifying so quickly here. It scares a lot of people, and we're losing sight of those grassroots organizations that were here doing it all on their own, with no foundation help, with nothing, just by sheer survival skills and networking skills and everything. So we wanted to go out, and it was like, how do you win that community over? And as sort of the big white institution on the block that's kind of elitist, and there's a lot of relationship building you have to do, right? You have to go as a curator, you have to get out of your office and go in and spend time with those people and go to their meetings and be welcoming to them in any way you can, get them here to the museum. So networking skills are paramount to developing these relationships out in the community, and they're incredibly rewarding. Some of this was another program I did with Dawood Bey. He came here to Detroit, and we worked with a local high school, and it was really my first community project like that. And I spent a day every week at that high school. I would just take the day off work, and I would go and spend time in that classroom and kind of embed myself. Even when nobody talked to me, and I was just sort of the white lady in the room, and I would just go and eventually everybody came around. I mean, it takes a long time to relationship build and make partnerships out in your communities. So and don't be afraid to do that ever. It's super, super rewarding. And yeah, you'll get criticized, and you'll get praise, and you have to be used to taking it all in and kind of making the best out of these situations, learning from them. So that's my advice on that respect.
I totally agree with that. And when I'm talking to graduate students who are thinking about teaching versus being a curator, I think getting a lot out of working collaborative, whether you're thinking about your audience for a show or working with artists or working with high school students, as you were saying, Nancy, that has, I think, to be enjoyable to you to enjoy being a curator, because when you're just in the library writing, which I also love to do, you're not really interacting, you don't have a dialogue with an audience. And what's very different about curating is that you have a dialogue with an audience, you have a dialogue with colleagues, with students, what have you. And I think that you have to enjoy that part of the job. 30 years ago, I think it wasn't nearly as big a part of the job, but in today's world it is. Partly because there's not as much money. People have to partner with other institutions in order to get things done and funded.
Right.
So you have to enjoy that part of the job, I think, in order to enjoy being a curator.
Right, yeah.
And so how about kind of a curveball question? What happens when a collaboration just can't seem to get off the ground, either because a higher up has been saying, we really want you to work with so-and-so partner. So-and-so partner is not necessarily as keen. So how do you sort of work around the fact that sometimes, some partnerships just don't happen or are meant to be?
It happens for sure. I had a case where at Montclair, we were partnering with a local college to do a competition for an artist project. And it worked for 1 year, and then kind of changes at the college happened so that it just didn't continue. And, there was kind of no hard feelings about it, but it just wasn't going to work. It was clear that it was an experiment that failed. Even though we did do it for 1 year, it just couldn't continue. And then in terms of working with artists, I have had to stop working with artists at certain times. In one case, my director pulled the plug on a project, mostly because of funding, and it was terrible to have to tell this to the artist, but there was nothing I could do. And then another time I was working with an artist who was just so difficult that I pulled the plug, and I had a small staff, and I was just like, I can't do this. It's not worth it. And I talked to my director about it, and she said, yep, you should pull the plug. And I did. And, I'm not going to work with that artist again. He was pretty angry, but I don't want to work with him again. But we managed to maintain a good relationship with the gallery, and the dealer understood it. And, sometimes things just don't work, and I think you have to cut your losses and move on.
Yeah, I think too, talking it out and thinking it through. And often we have people wanting to collaborate with us, and sometimes these things fizzle out on their own. They were never kind of meant to be, but we find we entertain everybody who comes to us. We listen to them. We try to make partnerships happen. Some things we recognize right away. We just don't pass to do them. Or in talking to colleagues in other museums, we know we should stay away from certain partnerships, right? So I think it's important to have your professional network out there too, so you can talk to people about what's working, what's not working. I mean, the hard part is getting a challenge and having to carry it through. And then you have to just kind of sort of suck it up as sort of life lessons learned. What can I learn from this? That's what I always say to myself when I'm dealing with something very challenging. There's got to be a reason for this. I'm going to learn something in this process. It may not all work out the way I want it to or the way the team wants it to, but you have to kind of back up sometimes from situations.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you both sharing the kind of trauma stories, because I think, you know, professionally of ourselves, we have the expectation that we can only succeed. And I think, you know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but especially as women, we feel like even greater expectation to have to make things work. It's just kind of how the system has sort of shaped gender norms for women, especially, that, you know, you don't complain, you meet a challenge, and if something's difficult, well, you don't want to be perceived as the difficult one, so you just kind of power through. So I think it's really great to hear that sometimes, you know, you're doing as much as you can, and at a certain point, you just have to cut your losses. And that says nothing about you as an individual or as a professional, but that, you know, some people are not coming to the table with the same sense of teamwork and wanting to be a team player and intent to be generous collaborators. And in those cases, you know, you're going to have to be your own advocate and do what's best for you and the institution. So I think we're about at time, and I can hang on for another few moments if there are any last questions that had yet to be asked, but I really got a lot out of the conversation. Thank you so much, Alex and Nancy, for sharing. And I myself am a junior curator, so I got lots of great tips and insights into, you know, the new norm of collaboration. And thanks again for your time. And Mentees, I hope you found it as helpful too. And I believe I would be more than happy to make myself available for questions afterwards. And I know AAMC can connect mentees to me, and Alex and Nancy, I'll let you say for yourself your willingness to connect with mentees afterwards for more kind of, you know, personal questions. I know even anonymous, it can be a little intimidating to ask the real, you know, difficult question.
Yeah, please, by all means, reach out. I've learned many lessons here in my 20 years, and I'm happy to pass along any advice I can. Always happy to talk to fellow colleagues and young women coming up in the field.
Me too. Absolutely. The Hannah at AAMC or Christina both know how to reach me.
Great. Thank you all, and have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
And, see you in Montreal, if not before. Bye.
Bye.